Hey friends, quick reminder that at the end of this month, patrons are going to start getting access to a new podcast I'm producing called I Wish I Knew You. I'm going to be doing profiles of queer and trans folks from history because, contrary to popular belief, the concept of being transgender was not invented on Tumblr. To support the show and get access to this at the end of the month, head to patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto and consider a donation to support what we're doing. I've got some pretty amazing stuff planned and I'm stoked to share it all with you, and patrons get to hear it all first. Love you, friends. Thanks. Hello, dear friends. My name is Callie Wright, and this is the Atheist Manifesto. I feel like if there's any group of people who have to constantly feel like a political football basically all of the time, it's got to be ex-Muslims, especially ex-Muslims who tend towards the leftist side of the political spectrum. I've seen all manner of white people and never Muslims explaining to ex-Muslims what their background is, how they're supposed to feel, how they're ex-Musliming wrong. And to be honest, it just looks like it's really, really exhausting. And so to have a talk about it, we have Atheist Twitter's favorite ex-Muslim, host of the Polite Conversations podcast, Eiynah. Welcome, friend.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me on. Definitely favorite.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Especially lately.
Oh, yeah.
So for those who aren't
popular.
Right. And it's the greatest. So for those who aren't familiar, can we just start by hearing a little bit of your backstory? Tell me, where you came from, how you left Islam, how you got to where you are today, and all that fun stuff.
Mm-hmm. So I'm of Pakistani background, but I grew up in Saudi Arabia. And, even though my parents weren't, they're pretty liberal, progressive Muslims, I still grew up in a theocracy. So I saw the hard, far right interpretation of Islam all around me, almost all the time. And, that didn't leave a great impression on me. So I kind of was put off religion, for as far back as I can remember. But when I started having the language to express myself, as soon as I could, really, I think I was a teenager when I officially declared that, no, I'm not a Muslim. I remember my mom was like, oh my God. But they were okay. They were fine. They kind of expected it. Cause even when I was little, I'd be running away from my Quran teacher, hopping on my bike and just hiding in the bushes. And my dad would have to come looking for me and stuff. So it wasn't really shocking for them. And and then I moved to Canada and went to university here. And now I live in Canada.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I feel like, like most sorts of groups of one kind or another, whether it's religion or race or any of that kind of stuff, I feel like especially atheists, but I feel like everyone in general kind of has this idea of Islam and Muslims as a monolith, right? And and this was definitely a blind spot that I had at one point. And somebody was like, "Oh yeah, a gay Muslim," and I was like, "Wait, what a minute? What? Those exist? Yeah. What?" Yeah. And then it's like, "Well, yeah, duh. There are all manner of super progressive to super conservative Muslims, just like there are Christians in every other religion in the world." And I think that's, I don't know, I think that's sort of the base of the conversation that I'm sort of past that point in my life, but years and years ago when I was, just figuring out that I was an atheist, that was a thing that took me a minute. And so I feel like that even that illuminates a large part of the conversation we're going to have. So something that I'm really interested in is this dynamic. Like I said in the intro, I feel like you kind of have to feel like a bit of a political football because if you as an ex-Muslim speak out against some of the awful things that happen in that world that have to do with religion in one way or another, you have this whole cabal of angry white dudes on Twitter cheering you on. But when you moderate that by not feeding into sentiments that obviously spill over into outright anti-Muslim and frankly racist ideas, then they turn into an angry mob. That's got to be exhausting.
It's constant and it is very, very exhausting. What when I have like very little patience for Islamism apologists and far right Muslims, then I'm like patted on the back and like, wow, you don't take bullshit at all. But when I'm the same way with the Western far right, it's like, I'm like this impatient bitch who can't tolerate any opinions different from her or whatever. Where's that, nuance and compassion for the Islamists then? I don't know. I'm the same person both ways. I just don't like conservatism or right wingery. And I don't have a lot of time or patience for splitting hairs between who's a Holocaust denier and who's a Holocaust apologist, or who's a white nationalist and who's a white supremacist.
Well, right. And I mean, those are as a person who prides myself on appreciating nuance, like there's not really a distinction there. Like, come on, guys.
No, exactly. That's why I'm like, what are you doing here? Why is this the hill you've chosen, And so my journey from leaving Islam, finding an atheist community online, an ex-Muslim community online, I felt like, wow, there's a group of people like me, who want to joke about and criticize religion. This is all so great, I never had that in real life until I met a bunch of atheists on Twitter, right? Like, I mean, all of my friends, most of them were secular anyways, but it wasn't like they weren't as interested and disliking religion as I was. So it was cool to find a community, but then things turned really bad very quick as well within the atheist scene, as you probably know, right?
Yep. Yeah, take me through that.
I mean, so that's been like such a huge disappointment. Firstly, it's hard to leave your religion, like to begin with, right? Because there's a sense of community and you're like, well, no, I'm different from you. I don't practice. And so that sets me apart from my family and community. Even though we have like a good relationship, I'm very fortunate. My parents are very accepting and loving and we have a great relationship. There's still like a difference, right? Mm-hmm. And, so now I'm at this phase with movement atheism where I feel like I'm leaving another religion and the community is so mad at me, and I'm constantly getting online attacks for that. And yeah.
And why do you think that is? Because, there are lots of ex-Muslims who have really embraced the right wing, like 100% fair to criticize a religion and ideas that come from religion, right? Like, I mean, if you're an atheist, that's kind of the thing. But like, I mean, to me, that very obviously spills over into just blatant racism and blatant anti-Muslim bigotry specifically, right? Like in the same way that like, they would yell at a Westboro Baptist. Nobody thinks twice if they show up to like a Westboro Baptist protest and they're like screaming in people's faces. But like, I feel like
same thing. If you're going to an Islamist protest, fine, treat those people like how you would like Westboro Baptist. But you don't have to assume every average Muslim walking down the street is like that.
Well, right. And I mean, that would literally be like walking into the Unitarian church with the Black Lives Matter sign outside and just screaming in their faces about religion, like just leaving context completely out of it,
Yeah.
I mean, why do you think that is?
I honestly, I feel like there's a very literalist quality and dogmatic quality to some of the atheists that congregate online, right? They're so tribal. They're very, very just like a religious person, like just like the people I wanted to leave behind.
Right.
And it just took me a while to figure out that these are the same kinds of people, but they're just like that on the other side. So you can't criticize, their favorite podcasters. You cannot blaspheme. You cannot, you can't have different opinions from them. They'll just like come in mobs online. And ex-Muslims especially is a sore point because they're such a useful tool if they want to be for people who want to perpetuate right-wing talking points. Look at this ex-Muslim. she or he says that Muslim immigration is bad, and even she or he recognizes that Muslims are secretly plotting to breed and take over and spread Sharia all over the West, like this kind of nonsense, right? There are some horrendous ex-Muslims that kind of have like Nazi-esque talking points,
Yeah, and in my endless quest to try to be understanding and compassionate to people, like, I mean, some of these folks have had absolutely horrific experiences, right? And I feel like that attitude has to be colored by those experiences, right?
Absolutely.
And so there's a part of me that wants to honor those feelings, but then, that also ends up in like innocent people get killed because of this shit. Like,
but look, if you're a victim of abuse, that does not give you the right to go around and be abusive, right?
Absolutely.
I understand the blind, irrational rage and hate and anger, especially as you're first coming out of it. But some of these people have been out of it and away from that for over a decade. This is just like a career for them now.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, a lot of people like to use that, so-and-so was abused by their spouse or their religious spouse or their religious parents. That's why they're so hateful. And that's why they justify hate crimes against Muslims. I'm like, but that's no excuse.
Yeah. And so does this make you feel like you need to walk on eggshells sometimes? Like, I feel like if it were me, like it would set me up for feeling like I can't say anything because there's 100 people waiting to weaponize everything I say. Like, regardless of what I actually mean, people are going to take it and do what they want with it. Like, is that a thing that you worry about or deal with?
I deal with it. Yeah. I don't worry because then I wouldn't say anything. Right. Like, so, I just say what I want. I just speak my mind and I deal with what comes after. Like, if I did worry, then I'd be having a much more safe Twitter account where, I was just saying the appropriate and accepted anti-Islam things for the movement atheists, and they would love me, and I would be getting book deals and have these cringeworthy events where I sit on stage with Peterson and who else.
I totally don't get the reference. I don't understand what you mean. You mentioned earlier, being able to joke and say things that might get you in trouble in certain places about religion. So like I remember when I first got into atheist groups on Facebook, I saw like 10,000 different versions of the Jesus fucking Christ meme. That's just, it's just deliberately offensive. It's not promoting any other kind of message. And then there's, draw Muhammad Day in response to the taboo in Islam of drawing pictures of Muhammad. And what made me actually want to ask about this is I saw this video circulating on Twitter and Facebook of a somewhat popular ex-Muslim walking around a pride festival with a sign that said Muhammad was gay, right? And
no, I think it was Allah was gay.
Allah was okay. Yeah. And again, like on one hand, I get it, right? Like you spend your entire life being repressed and being told it's terrible to do this thing. You're going to go to hell if you do this thing. And there's this sense of freedom and being able to say, well, fuck that. I'm going to do the thing. But there's also part of me that's like, I don't know, that kind of just makes you a dick. But
right. Well, let's think about it this way, right? There's Muslims that are gay that are marching in that parade that kind of need the solidarity and create the space for themselves within the faith, right? Mm-hmm. And absolutely, ex-Muslims also need that space. But I don't know how helpful it is to go and I also come with a lot of context for this person, right? They're a former extremist who I don't really think has left extremism behind. They go on these far-right publications like Rebel Media, which is like Canadian Breitbart, and they talk about like how Islam has no place in modern times. Like, it's basically like they just want Islam not to exist, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a strange talking point in a time where the far right is so ready to treat Muslims badly, where Trump wants Muslims banned and things like that. It's just you have to think of time and place, right? Like when I'm in Pakistan and I'm speaking with my atheist friends there, the conversations that we have about Muslims would so not be appropriate in Canada, right? Because there's only Muslims in Pakistan. There's no anti-Muslim bigotry really from
Hmm.
anyone that's in power. So Muslim background atheists feel so much more comfortable in those countries where Islam is in power, where Muslims are in power, to push back a lot harder.
Hmm.
Even within their drawing rooms and whatever, they can't do it publicly because then they'll have serious consequences. But some of the things that they say about hijabs and Muslims, and me coming from an international perspective, I used to be like, whoa, whoa, how could you say that? But it's like, it makes sense. It makes sense when your only oppressor is it's like how Western people talk about Christians here,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
There's no real threat of anti-Christian bigotry. But if you were to go to Pakistan where Christians are marginalized and threatened and in danger, you can't talk about Christians in the same way that you do, or especially not join up with right-wing Islamist papers to shit on a minority of Christians
Hmm.
in Pakistan. So you have to keep those things in mind.
Yeah, context is everything. And that's kind of why I asked the question, because like I'm also the one who stood in front of a bunch of evangelical Christian bigoted protesters making out with my wife. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And it's like I'm like throwing it in their faces because it feels good. And
Yeah.
and then I think I'm the one who's always saying like not everything you do has to serve some greater activist purpose, right? Like maybe I'm just doing this thing because I need to express myself and it feels good. Like I have so many feelings about this, and on one hand it feels reasonable to ask the question, like, what is the purpose of this? Like, why are we doing this? Is this actually helping? But then it also it feels to me like policing a set of legitimate feelings.
Well, again, it's the context thing,
Yeah.
right? If
Hmm.
you're standing with another minority group that's also trying to fight for their rights, like gay Muslims, then I don't know, like, how helpful. Like, I don't care. You can say Allah is gay to me, whatever, like, however much you want. I don't give a
Yeah.
crap, right? But I just think that strategically, and it's not effective communication. I don't know what you're trying to do with this, especially when minorities are at play, right?
Hmm.
With you, it's different. I guess if you're kind of throwing stuff in the face of Christians, it would be like me and someone else throwing stuff in the face of Muslims in Pakistan or in Saudi Arabia, where they are in power and there is no one using that, like, no one abusing that minority.
Yeah, so I mean, it comes back to just like what we always talk about with like making jokes and comedy and stuff. It's punching up versus punching down.
Right. And so many people don't get that, right?
Yeah.
This is the same person who had that Allah is gay sign also thinks that circumcision is like worse than the Holocaust. Now,
So like again, a legitimate thing to criticize, and there are problems, but
oh, I'm no
like,
fan of circumcision. I criticize it all the time,
but yeah,
this is ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
And again, in a climate where anti-Semitism is on the rise.
Mm-hmm.
So they do these things like Islam is worse than Nazism is their favorite thing. This is just not helpful. This is juvenile, and it just makes you look like a dumbass and a dickhead.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought. Because like you said, context is everything. And I try to be aware of the fact that this is not my background. And so there are almost certainly things that matter in context that I won't have just because that's not an environment that I grew up in. Especially I don't even have the, I grew up in an oppressive Christian environment and escaped that. Like, there's not even really that parallel for me.
Yeah.
So I just try to be cognizant of the fact that there just may be some shit that I'm missing there, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
So speaking of political footballs, while we're going there, I feel like there's this perpetual debate, and it's not even I don't think it's even relegated to just atheist circles. I feel like this is almost sort of a mainstream debate about about the hijab, right?
Yeah.
And if it's a choice, then it's a choice, and it can be empowering because it's a choice. But there are places where you can be punished severely for not doing it, and And there's this fight amongst, I guess, liberals versus leftists on that. And I'm curious where you come down. I mean, generally speaking, my thing is like I just kind of try to stay in my lane and just elevate the voices of folks who are talking about that, again, because I don't have the context or the background for it. So like, I don't feel qualified to have an opinion. So like, I'm interested in your thoughts on that whole debate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I mean, I'm a woman that grew up in a theocracy and had to deal with morality police when I was very little. I saw like a morality police guy like go after my mom, like tap her ankle with a cane because her headscarf slipped. So these are like horrific things to me, right? Like the way I see it sometimes normalized and glamorized and romanticized in the West is quite off-putting, even though I understand the desire to stand in solidarity with people that are visibly Muslim. And I do too. But at the same time, I recognize that this outside of places where people have a choice is not really an empowering thing. And you may personally feel empowered by it somehow. I don't know. But on the whole, it's strange to try and reclaim a garment that is being used to oppress majority of the wearers around the world, you know?
Yeah. And like, I have that feeling. And then I have a friend who told me that her sister is Muslim and she was like chased down on the sidewalk and somebody like ripped it off of her and was like ready to beat the shit out of her. And I'm like, I feel like awful about that too. Like neither of those things are okay.
Right, exactly. And this is the nuance that's missing from the mainstream discussion because people just like to speak in extremes, or those are the things that get attention. Either it's totally feminist, totally empowering, totally amazing, or either it's like this evil Islamist symbol and the people wearing it are dehumanized to the point where people can attack them in the streets or in subways and stuff. And that's horrible. So the way that I like to put it is that I'm intellectually opposed to sort of like modesty gear, like religious modesty gear, which includes the niqab and the hijab and all of that. But it's not really my place to go and even lecture or have attitude with individuals who wear it because I don't know what their situation is. And also we have to recognize that the hijab and the niqab is the face veil, are different things, right? Somewhat the hijab has kind of been reclaimed. Like people do wear it for purposes that are not just like extremely devout. They wear it just to like show, I don't know, cultural solidarity and stuff like that.
Real quick, can you explain the difference for me?
Between hijab and niqab?
Yeah.
So hijab is like the headscarf. And niqab is like the headscarf plus the face veil.
Got it. Okay.
So, yeah. So the hijab is worn by some people that are fairly progressive. They are not necessarily the right-wing Muslims that you're thinking that they are, right? But the niqab, there will be people who will get mad that I say this. But the niqab is definitely like indicative of some extreme beliefs. So, and that has not really been, how do you reclaim that even? I don't understand, right? How do you wear that just as a nod to your culture?
How do you mean extreme beliefs? Just like just extremism around modesty, or how do you mean?
Yeah. I mean, like it usually comes with views like women should cover themselves from head to toe because if they, cause a man to feel lust, then, it's their fault. And just other things, usually, you can ask people wearing niqab their views about, sexuality, LGBT communities or whatever. It's like the way I view it is sort of like someone wearing a Kekistan t-shirt.
Oh, right.
I'm not going to like their views. I kind of like, I don't think I'm wrong to judge someone for that shirt that they're wearing, or a Trump hat, even like a MAGA hat. Right.
Yep.
So similarly, I understand that Muslim women are minorities, but if they're going to wear far right garments that show that their views are far right, yes, they could have been forced into it. And then it's totally not their fault. But there are those who advocate for it online, who are activists for it, and who call anyone who criticizes it even a little bit, like me, alt-right.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Well, and and another discussion that I don't really feel like is had, or at least I don't see it. I mean, the fact that I don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening, but is, I feel like people see choice as a strict binary, right? Like a person is either forced into this against their will under threat of harm or death, or it is a 100% free choice that a person makes. And I mean, basically, like this entire conversation, I feel like there is so much more nuance to the conversation than that, because, we have to talk about cultural pressures and,
Oh, yeah. Family pressures.
Yeah. And what people are taught about women's place in society as they grow up. Right. And that's, in feminism, there's always this discussion about choice feminism. Right. And as like, if you're making the choice to do this thing that feeds into feminine stereotypes, people sometimes will criticize that. And then I'm like, yeah, but feminism is supposed to be about women doing whatever they want. Right. And the argument
but that doesn't
is
mean that whatever they do or whatever they choose is feminist necessarily.
Right. Well, right. Yeah. And that's the conversation. And then so then we run into holding individuals responsible for their cultural upbringing. And so like, how do we separate that? Because if you're taught this thing from birth and you never get exposed to different viewpoints, I mean, at some point you're an adult, like you have to be responsible for the things you think and believe.
But that's like, extreme Republicans, right?
Yeah.
At some point you got to hold them responsible for their own beliefs, right?
Yep.
But you also have to understand that, yes, when you're indoctrinated from childhood, that really plays a part.
Yeah. So, I think the bottom line is like, obviously this is a struggle, right? It's a complicated conversation. There are concerns around safety and social concerns. And so kind of the last thing that I'd like to hear you go over, like, you probably run into a lot of just like absolutely clueless white people and never Muslims that like just don't get it. Right. And I'm curious just on your thoughts, like, what do you see people missing that like you wish people would educate themselves on, you wish people would understand better?
Well, I see it on all sides of the political spectrum, sadly. I mean, I am more sympathetic to the left, obviously, having the same values myself and being concerned for minorities and caring about diversity and stuff like that. So I understand the place where like these well-intentioned lefties are coming from when they're like, niqabs are empowering and they're feminists, and hey, don't get mad at public schools that have hijab as part of the uniform, like for children. And I'm like, oh, no.
Right.
We want progress in our communities too. And if we keep running into well-intentioned people on the left that keep making excuses for Islamic schools to push headscarves on children in school, then that's not going to help. I really wish that they would understand that we need to push our right wing as well. Mm-hmm. And on the right, obviously, I wish that they would understand that Muslims exist on a spectrum like any other theist. They're not robots. The other day, I had this Twitter troll who was just so persistent that every single Muslim endorsed explicitly every single verse of the Quran, because if they didn't, then that means that they reject the Quran and therefore they're not Muslim. And I'm like, that's just not how humans work.
I was like, I have to wonder if he holds Christians to the same standard. I have to wonder.
No. People asked him repeatedly in that thread, and he does not, because he's like, oh, well, they're not the same.
Of course.
So, yeah, but he was like, I kept saying that, not everyone knows every verse. Like when I was growing up in Saudi, as a non-Arab Muslim, I was taught the Quran in Arabic. Everyone's taught the Quran in Arabic. Most people don't get taught translation. So you are just, you're just reciting meaningless words. This is what you're supposed to do, and you're just saying it, right? It's kind of like how if you were to go and learn stuff in Latin, wouldn't really mean much to you. but you
Right.
just
It's
say
just
it.
parroting it. Right.
Yes. So
Oh,
how do you think that they explicitly know and endorse every verse? They don't even know them. Now as an ex-Muslim, I know so much more about the Quran, so much more about the verses because I really, really looked into it, right?
hmm.
And I surprise people that are still theists in my family when I'm like, when my douche atheist side comes out, and I'm like, well, what is that verse? And they're like, wait a minute, there's no verse like that. And I'm like, oh yes, there is. And then we look it up and they're just like stunned because they've never encountered the verse before. So, I mean, this is how human Muslims are, right? They don't know every verse in their book.
Hmm.
A lot of them don't know a lot of verses in their book. They just like practice Islam because that's what they're taught since they're little. They're not these robots that just, you know, as soon as you read the Quran, you have a photographic memory and all the verses are like downloaded into your brain. You're like, yes, Sharia, activate, Doesn't
Right.
work like that. So I wish people would understand that on the right.
Yeah. Well, and it's especially thinking about like atheist folks in the United States. I mean, I think even the most ardently atheist person recognizes that nuance in Christianity, right?
Yeah.
They will acknowledge that, yeah, there are plenty of socially progressive Christians that like I agree with on everything but God.
Yeah.
And, there's a whole spectrum of from that to the Westboro Baptist Church and like, miles and miles of space in between that people fall into. And, I wonder, is that tendency cultural? Is it the human tendency to think of out groups as monolithic? You know what I mean? Like, and I feel gross saying that because it removes personal responsibility and says like, it's not your fault, you're a bigot, which is not the case, right?
Well, you can certainly rise above it. I'm sure humans do
Absolutely.
have a tendency to think that way, but people rise above it all the time and educate themselves and empathize, right?
Mm-hmm.
But some people just don't have empathy for out groups.
Yeah.
So that's how it goes then. Muslims are robots.
Right.
And they all are like, they all know exactly what they're doing. It's all some evil plot. And then they get confused. And then it gets so confusing when you hear about like, I did this episode recently on my podcast about Ramadan and all the weird inconsistencies that I came across, right? Like there would be people who would refrain from sex during Ramadan, like even though premarital sex is not allowed at all.
Mm-hmm.
So they would feel really a lot better than the people that just continued having sex with their boyfriends and girlfriends, and then they would judge those people. There were people that refrained from alcohol. There were people that, and then they broke their fast with a beer. There were people that refrained from alcohol only on the holy days of Ramadan. And it was just really strange. Like alcohol is forbidden anyway.
Right.
So, I had a friend who would drink with me during Ramadan. But one time we invited her over for drinks and it happened to be one of the holiest nights of Ramadan. I didn't know. I don't keep track of these things. She was
Right.
already drinking with me in the holy month. So I thought, hey, she's whatever, nothing to worry about. But she's like, oh, you're drinking on the 27th of Ramadan? That's just awful, And I'm like, what? What? You were drinking with me on the 26th?
It sounds like the kid in grade school who was always saying all kinds of nasty shit about girls, but like getting really uptight when I said, God damn it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are just human failings, right? They're not able to be so literal and perfect because they're human.
Yeah. Well, and I think like a lot of things, what it comes down to is a failure of listening, right? Because, we're all probably familiar with cognitive biases, right? We look for things that reinforce our preconceived notions. We dig our heels in when something challenges those. And, and in that, we see ex-Muslims and people on the left, rightly or wrongly, tend to see Muslims and ex-Muslims as a marginalized group because in the United States they are, right? People on the right tend to see them kind of in the same way, but more as a tool to promote a political agenda that is like largely racist and xenophobic. Whereas I feel like on the left, it's more of a like, I want to feel good about myself for helping these poor downtrodden people. And like, and people get caught in the middle, and we sort of forget. And again, like you, I think this happens on all sides of the political spectrum, right? It's this monolithic group of people becomes a tool to promote whatever ideology, whatever interests or inclinations that we have. And we just sort of forget to think of them as like whole and complicated human beings. And, and it's kind of like the same conversation I have about queer and trans stuff all the time. It's like, society makes this shit way more complicated than it has to be, because like literally everything that we've said in the last 35 minutes of this interview, I feel like should be obvious, right?
Yeah.
Like if people would listen.
Can I say, like, I relate to something in the trans conversation very much, like how, how there are these, I guess, detransitioners. I don't know if my language is appropriate or up to date or whatever. Tell me if I'm saying anything offensive.
No, you're good. So you're talking about people who transition and then detransition back to their assigned birth gender for one reason or another.
Right.
Yeah.
But then they're used for political purposes to sort of shit on trans people, right? Whether they themselves may have a legitimate, experience and struggle and all of that. But then there's people waiting to capitalize on that experience. Similarly, I know it's not the same thing at all, but that's kind of how I feel the position that ex-Muslims are in as well.
Yeah. Well, and what gets lost in that conversation is that in most cases that I'm aware of, not all cases, but most cases that I'm aware of, we're talking about trans women who find life so horrifying post coming out that they don't want to live in society as women. And they're not happy about detransitioning. They don't want to, but they feel like to make the world a more navigable place, they have to, right? And that is the part of the conversation that gets left out in that, because when they hear like, oh, like I'm transitioning because this is who I am and it's going to be helpful and it's going to make me happy and I'm going to be living as my true self and all of that sort of stuff. And when you hear about someone detransitioning, the logical place to go for people who are anti-trans is, well, all of that must have been bullshit. But like nobody stops to think. It's like, no, like people like you, not you, Eiynah, but like, the conservative people are missing the fact that it's like, no, actually people like you make life so fucking miserable for trans people that they would rather be slightly less miserable living their life as a person that they're not truly. And so, I think that is, because I can think of some parallels right between the experiences, but that is not one that I had thought of. And that's super deep.
Yeah, because I can't tell you how many emails I get from ex-Muslim atheists now that are saying they don't want to come out or identify with this movement because of what it's become, because of the people that represent it, because of the prominent ex-Muslims. They hate the term. They don't want anything to do with it. And it's really sad, because at some point I did think that using ex-Muslim was important because it signifies that we should normalize apostasy in Islam. But that journey has become so tainted. It has become understood as a right-wing thing now. And that's kind of how I saw from my layperson's eyes, the detransition angle, where people were just waiting to jump on their stories to use to delegitimize other people.
Yeah, it's real gross. Well, Eiynah, thank you so much for coming on the show and having this conversation. It's one that I've kind of wanted to do for a while. Like we've strayed away from things for a long time, really focusing around religion and atheism and all of that kind of stuff. But I think, I think this is a conversation that's more important, because I feel like there's more, I feel like there is generally speaking, there is allowed to be some nuance in the conversation, like as it relates to religious privilege and religious exceptionalism when it comes to Christianity than there is in Islam, right? And I feel like there's a more complicated dynamic there. That's a conversation that I don't hear happen enough. Really, I don't think in the atheist community, at least not with the right kind of
You're
nuance.
demonized for trying to have that conversation. So
yeah, and especially not in the broader public sphere.
I drag any trolls your way when you put this out.
It happens. But my thing is like, I have a supportive enough community that I can kind of weather whatever comes my way. Like I've taken certain precautions to keep myself safe. Like the name of my employer is nowhere on any of my social media. So like people would have to dig ridiculously hard to find that. And so like, you know what, let them come. Cause if we weren't pissing those people off, I would, well, let me frame it a different way. If we're making those people angry, that means we're probably doing something important.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, Eiynah, why don't you plug all your things? Tell us about your podcast real quick. Tell us where we can find you online, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Nice Mangoes, no E in mangoes. And I have a podcast called Polite Conversations, which you can find on iTunes and SoundCloud and YouTube. Just Google Polite Conversations podcast. I'm on Facebook, but I keep getting shut down over there. But for now, you can look me up. Eiynah, Eiynah. And yeah, it was a pleasure coming to chat with you, Callie. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. And there will be links to all of those things in the show notes. That, my friend, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. If you think what we do here is important, please share this around to your friends. Search the Gaytheist Manifesto on Facebook and Twitter to find us there. I'm at Gaytheist Callie on Twitter, and you can email us at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com. We're a part of the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative. We're a group of trans podcasting badasses working to bring more trans voices into podcasting and other content creation. Search the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative on Facebook for more info. If you want to support the show and the activism we do, you can head to patreon.com/thegaytheist manifesto. Make a per episode donation as little as $1 per episode. And if you can't do that, you can give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and share us around to your friends. It all helps and it all makes a difference. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.